Well, I figured that would depend on the cheese. No, not Swiss. That's Bush. That's Bush League. Maybe, I don't know. Oh, hey everybody. Adam Welch here for another episode of Straight Talk on Photography. Today we're going to be looking at Tamron's new 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8 Di III RXD. This is for Sony full frame mirrorless or crop sensor mirrorless cameras. In short, it is for Sony E mount or FE mount for the full frame, and it is Tamron's second such lens. The first being their, I think it was a 28 to 75 millimeter f2.8. I reviewed that one too, if I'm not mistaken, so I'll post a little thumbnail for you to take a look at that video too. But before we jump into this, I want to say a quick thank you to all my awesome new followers. I've had a huge influx of folks coming and checking out the channel lately, so welcome guys, I really appreciate it. Stay tuned if you don't already, hit that little bell and you'll know whenever I post ridiculous videos like this. So back to the juice. You know, when I started out with mirrorless cameras, I think it was back in 2013 when I made the jump from my Canon DSLR to my A7R Mark I, which I'm filming on it right now. I love the camera, I'm probably not going to switch. But we had a problem back then, the mirrorless guys, because there weren't that many lenses. Most of the lenses that we had, I think there was maybe 4 or 5 for the A7 series when it very first was launched. And then of course that's ballooned out. Sony has, God, I don't know how many lenses Sony has now. The G Master series, a lot of high-end glass. But then you have other companies like Rokinon, Tamron, case in point, Sigma. We have a lot of people finally producing excellent lenses for these full frame Sony mirrorless cameras, and this happens to be one. Taking a quick look around the lens, you'll notice that there is no manual or autofocus switch on there, and there is no image stabilization switch on there. That is because, of course, as far as I know, all these Sony full frame mirrorless cameras and the Sony crop sensor cameras that are mirrorless have the in-camera image stabilization and the in-camera autofocus and manual focus functionality. So there's not a whole lot of stuff going on the outside of the 17 to 28 millimeter. It is an internal zoom lens. That means it's not going to get any longer than this when you zoom from 17 to 28 millimeters. The zoom ring and the focus ring are all incredibly smooth. There's no play in there. And if I'm not mistaken, this has the full-time manual focus override for the autofocus, so you can tweak your autofocus manually and not have to switch to dedicated manual focus mode. And if you watched the last video on Tamron's 35mm f1.4, you probably heard me gripe a lot about the lens hood. In that particular lens, it had the little button that you had to press to take the lens hood off and then to put it back on. This one is just your good old-fashioned snap-on, snap-off lens hood, so I'm placated. Performance-wise, I have to say the autofocus on this was absolutely superb. Even in video, and I took a quick video, which we'll show you here in just a second, along with some other sample images. Performance-wise, I couldn't be happier with this lens. The autofocus was extremely quick, extremely quiet. I guess it's like a good haircut. They say, you know, if you can't tell that you have one, it is a good one. And I didn't pay any attention to the autofocus on this while I was using it. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. I shot with this a lot down in New Orleans in some street photography situations, and the autofocus was very quick, very silent, and very accurate. And you know, I have to talk about it, guys. All the modern Tamron lenses have this excellent weather sealing. You can see this gasket around the base of the lens. And that moisture control goes all the way through the lens, through each of the focusing ring and the zoom ring, as well as the front lens element here, if I'm not mistaken, where the front the lens barrel wraps around that glass. So before we get into the actual image samples and that video sample, let's run down the list of the specifications for this lens. It is, of course, a 17 to 28 millimeters, so a wide angle to quite wide angle telephoto zoom lens. The maximum aperture is a constant f2.8. And this lens seems to be par for course with some of the other Tamron lenses lately, in that it packs in quite a few optical elements and still keeps the weight extremely manageable. This lens has 13 elements and 11 groups, which is actually pretty surprising when you consider that it only weighs 420 grams or 14.8 ounces, so that comes in less than a pound. It has a 67 millimeter filter size. The overall length comes in just under 4 inches or 99 millimeters, and it has 9 circular aperture blades. That makes for really, really great bokeh, especially when you are zoomed in to that 28 millimeter mark. All right, so I'm gonna do something a little bit different than I normally do for the image samples. We've already seen some at the beginning of the video, but I'm going to switch over to the computer, and that way we can take a closer look at some of the sample images for this, and I can zoom in instead of having to have you just look at a static picture here on the video. So let's head over there, have a look. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the pictures I made with the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8. The audio here, guys, I know it sucks, but just bear with me. I'm having to use the audio from my laptop. The first picture we have here is from a friend of mine. His name is the artist Quinn. I met him here in the French Quarter in New Orleans, and he was kind enough to let me sit in and watch him paint for a few minutes. The overall sharpness here is actually really, really good. I have to say that when you zoom into the corners of the image, you can see a little bit of distortion happening and a little bit of edge softening. And there is some chromatic aberrations happening down here. Yeah, you can see them here. You have some green chromatic aberrations around the hubs of that bicycle. And over here on Quinn's chin, you can see you have some purple chromatic aberrations happening as well. Oh, and if you want to check out any of Quinn's work here, feel free to follow any of those links. Just pause the video. Now let's talk a little bit more about the chromatic aberration and that edge softening I was talking about with the 17 to 28 millimeter here. This is at 17 millimeters, and I'm in Lightroom. If I zoom into these corners, you can really start to see that edge softening and that purple chromatic aberration here in those high contrast areas. Now, Lightroom does not have a profile, at least I don't think they have a profile at the time this video was recorded, for the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8. But if you go to the manual chromatic aberration adjustment here in the lens corrections, you can easily get rid of that purple haze or the any of the other chromatic aberrations you might encounter with this lens. And it's really not that much of a problem, but at the same time, it is there and it is something to be considered. Let's look at a few more image samples here. This was made there at a swimming pool. This was handheld at f2.8. Excellent, excellent sharpness, even at ISO 3200 and f2.8. Here's another picture of the pool. I think we've saw this image before, but this was at an art garden there in New Orleans. That's at f2.8, 1/250th at 28 millimeters. Oh, this was another one that was actually, I think it was this one right here that we used at the beginning of the video. But if you zoom in here, not quite that much. The sharpness on this lens, this is f4.5 again. It's absolutely outstanding. The contrast is great. The color separation is wonderful. Now let's take a quick look at the video I shot with this lens. I'm going to switch over to the actual video clip so you can hear the real-time audio to discern whether or not that autofocus actually makes any sound. So that is going to wrap it up for Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter f f2.8 Di3 RXD. Again, this is their second lens to come out for Sony full frame cameras. Of course, it'll work on your crop sensor Sonys like your a6000s, your a6300s, cameras like that. Overall, a very serviceable little lens. It hits that sweet spot between a super wide angle and almost normal lens. It covers a wide field of view. I didn't get a chance to use this for any astrophotography work. I really think, even despite that chromatic aberration at f2.8 that we talked about, I think this would be a beast at some long exposure night sky work. In the end, you know, I'm coming off these absolutely amazing, the last two lens reviews were absolutely incredible. These amazing lenses, that 35mm f1.4 SP from Tamron and their 35 to 150 millimeter f2.8 to f4 that I absolutely still love. So this one had a lot to live up to. I definitely don't think it's a bad lens, but it does have a little bit more chromatic aberration and a little bit more edge softening at 17 millimeters than I would have liked. When you're stopping down to f4.5 and you're still seeing some of that chromatic aberration in the corner of the lens, that can be a little bit of a problem. You can take care of it, of course, in Lightroom or any other editing software just by applying a profile correction or manually getting rid of the chromatic aberration. So it's not a huge deal, but at the same time, you know, it is there. Final verdict on this: if you like shooting street photography, like I said, I was using it down in New Orleans. That autofocus is absolutely fantastic. It's very quiet, very accurate. Again, if you like shooting street photography on the wide end of the focal length range, I don't think you're going to be disappointed there. I think it would be an excellent landscape lens. If you are stopping down anything, you know, beyond that f4.5, f5.6 mark, which you usually are when you're shooting landscapes, usually you're shooting upwards of f8. I don't think you're going to have a problem with the chromatic aberration or that edge softening. What else? What else? Oh yeah, talking about that other Sony full frame lens that Tamron put out about a year ago that I had reviewed. This lens is almost like a complete scaled down version of that lens, but I had compared that 28 to 75 millimeter lens from Tamron to my Zeiss 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and I was talking about the similarities there. This lens, the 17 to 28 millimeter, looks like a carbon copy of that 24 to 70 millimeter Zeiss lens. So I thought that was really interesting. If you have any experience with that 24 to 70 millimeter, you will find it probably as weird as I did that this lens looks and handles on the camera almost exactly the same. Okay, that's going to wrap up the review of the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8 constant aperture Di3 RXD lens. Now, it may not be my most favorite lens, but I don't think you're going to be disappointed in it. You can find the full review of this coming to contrastly.com here in the near future, probably here in the next few days. I'll put a link down in the description. Oh, one more thing I will mention that's not related exactly to photography, but you remember in that last video on the Tamron 35mm SP, that f1.4, I mentioned that I'd got a new microphone. Well, that sucker died on me when I was doing a mic check for this video, so I think I got 2 videos out of that, and it worked great, you know, when it actually worked. But if you do go watch that video, there's a link in there for that microphone. I'm probably going to go over to Amazon and update that review to less than glowing. So just FYI if you're over there watching that video. Okay guys, I'm going to finally wrap it up here. I'm Adam Welch. This is Straight Talk on Photography. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again on the next episode. Until then, thanks a lot everybody.